So we are learning in this mimer, we're looking at the Mincha davening, Shabbos Mincha. And if you remember, we have four expressions, four sets of three that symbolize Chesed Gevur Tiferes, Ata Echad, V'Shimcha Echad, and Mikam Yisrael Echad Ba'aretz. That was the first set. Then we had the next set of three. I do think about this sometimes when I remember when I'm davening Mincha Shmona Esrei and Shabbos. Tiferes Gedula, Tiferes Yeshua, Yom Menucha Ukdusha Amcha Nasata. Second set of three. Avram Yagel, Yitzchak Yeranev, Yaakov Anav Yenuchova, third set of three. Menuchas Emes V'Nadava, Menuchas Emes V'Emuna, Menucha Shalom Hashket V'Vetach, Menucha Shlema Sha'ata Vayetze. Fourth set of three, plus one extra line, which we questioned. So we have four sets of three. And in the previous ice, the Rebbe unpacked this and said the first set, Ata Echad V'Shimcha Echad, Mika Am Yisrael Echad Ba'aretz, symbolizes Chesed Gevur Tiferes. All four of these are Chesed Gevur Tiferes. Chesed Gevur Tiferes, Kodim HaTzimtzum. Chesed Gevur Tiferes, before we have constriction, before we have the primordial contraction. And the next set, Tiferes Gedula, Tiferes, is Chesed Gevur Tiferes in what we call Adam Kadmon, the first revelation of the Ratzon Ha'elyon, of the supernal will, and Keser Vatzilus, those dimensions, is a second set. Avram Yagel, Yitzchak Yeranein, is the third set. Chesed Gevur Tiferes of Atzilus, which of course makes sense. Avram is Chesed, and Yitzchak is Gevura, and Yaakov is Tiferes. So Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Chesed Gevur Tiferes of Atzilus. And the last set, called the Menuchas, is Netzach Yisaid, which is the Chesed Gevur Tiferes as it comes down to Netzach Yisaid of Atzilus. So those are four sets of three. And the ice we are on now, the Rebbe is questioning that first expression, Ata Echad V'Shimcha Echad, and Mika Am Yisrael Echad Ba'aretz, which we said refers to Chesed Gevur Tiferes, Ata Echad, Shimcha Echad, Mika Am Yisrael Echad Ba'aretz Tiferes, Kodim HaTzimtzum. And it's like, wait a minute, what do we mean? We can say it glibly and not think about it, and we're all fine, because of course most things we say we don't think about, so we're fine. But if we think about it, what do we mean? This is Chesed Gevur Tiferes, Kodim HaTzimtzum. What is Chesed Gevur Tiferes Kodim HaTzimtzum? There are no dimensions Kodim HaTzimtzum. It's Eibishter. It's Eibishter Ripshitas. Just the simple being of God Himself. So it's just the simple being of God Himself, and there's no Chesed there, no Gevura there, no Tiferes there, or any other dimension there. There's no Spheros there, for sure not. So what are we talking about? The Spheros, Chesed Gevur Tiferes, before Tzimtzum, when there's no Spheros before Tzimtzum? That is the question that this ice is discussing. It says in Eitz Chaim, the Eitz Chaim is the recordings of Reb Chaim Vital, I didn't say the teachings of Reb Chaim Vital, I said the recordings of Reb Chaim Vital, because recording the teachings of the Arizal. So the Arizal explains, as is written in the Eitz Chaim by Reb Chaim Vital, that the whole concept of Tzimtzum, meaning the first primordial constriction to allow space, that there could be creation, comes from Hashem as Teva Hatov Lehetiv. The nature of one who is good is to do good. So since Hashem's nature is good, therefore He does good. Therefore there's tzimtzum, so there can be a space for creation. So Hashem, in His kindness and compassion and desire to give, constricts Himself to give, where there be the facility of giving, there being the dimension of giving, of creation, of worlds, of beings and creatures that can receive the beneficence of God. So because Teva Tov Lehetiv, because nature one who is good is to do good, and Hashem is good, and therefore His nature is to do good, therefore He constricted Himself to do good with creation. That's what it says in Eitz Chaim. So the Rebbe says, wait a minute. This concept, Teva HaTov Lehetiv, is prior to Tzimtzum HaRishon, because we're saying, because Hashem is Teva HaTov Lehetiv, therefore He constricted Himself to have creation that He can do kindness with. So this is all talking about before, prior. His Teva HaTov Lehetiv was the stimulus for Tzimtzum HaRishon, for the first primordial constriction. So it exists before it. So where does it exist? It exists in Hashem prior to Tzimtzum HaRishon. So we say, wait. So then there is Chesed prior to Tzimtzum HaRishon. Because Teva HaTov Lehetiv, the nature of one who is good, is to do good. The nature to do good is the nature of Chesed. So Chesed exists prior to Tzimtzum HaRishon. Well, that was fast, right? We had a question, we got an answer. We're not done. But again, our original question of this ice is Ata Echad, Chesed prior to Tzimtzum HaRishon, V'Shimcha Echad, Gevura prior to Tzimtzum HaRishon, Umika Am Yisrael Echad Ba'aretz, Tiferes prior to Tzimtzum Harishon. There's no Chesed, no Gvura, no Tiferes prior to Tzimtzum Harishon. They're saying, wait, there is. At least there's Chesed. We can see there's Chesed. This is based on the teachings of the Arizal, recording the Eitz Chaim. Teva Teva Hetiv. The whole constriction, this is, of course, a thought that's developed in Tanya at length in Shara Yichav Emunah. When we look at constriction, of course, constriction seems to us something bad. I mean, who wants constriction, right? We want Gilui. We want revelation. We don't want constriction. We don't want Hashem hiding. We want Hashem revealed. But the whole process of constriction was Hashem's chesed. Because if there wasn't constriction, there couldn't be creation. Hashem's presence is so overwhelming, there's no space, there's no breathing room for creation. We would be overwhelmed and snuffed out before we even came into existence by the enormous intensity of God himself. So out of chesed for us, out of a desire to give us, out of love for us, envision, before we were, Hashem already loved us so much. Like someone who gets married, well, most people get married, you think they get married for love of their spouse. But imagine someone getting married for love of the children that would be born. And because of love of those children, they get married because they know from this marriage will come those children. So Hashem has this vision of Klal Yisrael, us, a Jew on planet Earth, in Chicago to be precise, serving Hashem. And because of that vision of us, Hashem is mitzamtim himself. Hashem constricts himself. So Hashem is squashing himself, constriction, making his light smaller, making his life not as seen. Like, no, we don't want that. We want his light to be seen. We want miracles. We want breaking nature. We don't want nature. We don't want constriction. But understand constriction is part of Hashem's chesed. Because only through constriction can we be. And it's this is like a model. This is the prototype. The first expression of constriction is clearly for Gilui. The only reason why there's constriction is because there should be a Gilui. The only reason there's constriction is so there should be ultimately planet Earth, ultimately human being, Jew, serving Hashem. So all of the constrictions, and there's myriads of them, are to get to Gilui, are to get to the point of a human being on planet Earth serving Hashem. And that's the model. That's the primordial example. That's the prototype that everything else comes from. So the prototype of all constriction is for Gilui. The prototype of all constriction is for revelation. The prototype of all constriction is fueled by chesed, fueled by a desire to give to us, which I think has a very strong practical application, because when we go through constrictions, it doesn't feel very Gilui. It doesn't feel very like warm and expressive of Hashem's love for us. Constriction by definition feels constricted, feels cold and dark, and like we're in Tevis and the days are so short and they're so dark and it's so cold. Even if it's a more mild winter Chicago day, it's still cold, you know. Don't leave the door open too long. It's still going to be cold. Trust me. So it's constriction. The whole purpose of any and every constriction is for Gilui. If there wasn't the purpose of Gilui, there would never be this constriction. So this is an amazing perspective to have when we go through constrictions in our life, like we do. Constriction, Hashem, I'm not fooled. All constriction ultimately is fueled by your chesed. All constriction is fueled by your love for us. All constriction is for Gilui. So all of this is expressive of this point the Rebbe is making here, that Chesed Gvura Tiferes prior to Tzimtzum Harishon. There's nothing prior to Tzimtzum Harishon, just Hashem himself, not nothing, something. But that something is the pshitus of Hashem, Hashem in his absolute essence and being, and so to speak, simplicity, without any sophistication or demarcation or, breaking down into, the demographics of this is the Chesed camp and this is the Gvura and this is the Tiferes. There's none of that. Well, officially there's none of that, but actually there is. Because if there's Teva Tov L'Hetiv, that means there's Chesed. So prior to Tzimtzum Harishon, for sure we see Hashem's Chesed. Well, what about Gvura? What about Tiferes? Well, we'll speak about them. But before we speak about them, we take a long time to speak about a question and answer on this issue. Coming from a saying of our sages to understand this, just as the soul fills the body, so God fills the world. There says that statement, we got questions on. Why do we have questions on that statement? Well, our sages here are making a parallel concept, right? We have soul to body, God to world. The soul fills the body, God fills the world. The Rebbe says, but this is not parallel. Why is this not parallel? Because the soul, even when she's not in the body, always has the desire, the need to vivify, to give life. And that's why she gets in that body and gives it life. But Hashem, God, does not have this need to vivify creation. And that's why he gets in creation and vivifies creation. So the soul must give life and therefore invests itself in the body and gives life to the body. And God must give life and therefore invests himself in creation and gives life to creation. Beautiful, perfect parallelism. But that's not true. The Torah says that's not true. Because the soul does have this need, desire, being of giving life. That is like a definitive being of the soul, is that which gives life. And therefore she does need to get into this body to give it life. But God doesn't have these needs, as our sages say. God could have done it differently. God had no need that he must be in creation and create. There's no need. Of course, we can't say, and it took God a long time to do it or something like that, because time is only part of the parameters of creation. So there's no time before creation. So we can't give it a time. There was no time. But we can say there was no need. There was no need from God's end, like, I must create, I must vivify. No. As we just said, Hashem had this chesed, teva hatov l'heitiv, desire to do good, desire to give. But otherwise, he doesn't give life. No problem. He's doing other things. But the soul has this need to give life. How do we see the soul has a need for give life? So the Rebbe explains it in two ways. So one, the Rebbe says, is the fact that the soul is put in the body and gives it life is because this is her energy. This is what she does. And that's why this happens. And also the Rebbe says, continuing this idea, that sometimes, this is an interesting concept, sometimes after a person passes away, they are judged and sent to Gehenna for cleansing. And sometimes, instead of going to Gehenna for cleansing, they're sent back down to this world as a Gilgul, as a reincarnation, to go through life again, and through that process gain what we call tikkun, rectification of what they did wrong. But sometimes the soul is not worthy of going into another Jewish body, and instead the Gilgul, that we would not call a Gilgul at that point, is being sent into something inanimate or vegetation or animal, not the body of a Jew, a grain of wheat, a dog. Right? There's a famous story of a dog that went to the Arizal, Hakadosh, because there was an neshama in that dog, and the neshama was asking, how is he supposed to gain tikkun hanging out of the body of a dog? Right? There's a famous story of how a neshama was once neskalgal to a grain of wheat and spent a year inside a grain of wheat trying to get tikkun, which unfortunately didn't happen, but tried, suffered a lot. So obviously, for the neshama, being in the grain of wheat or being in the dog, being in the other animal, being in the inanimate, is tremendous pain for the neshama. You could say, well, why is it painful? This is where the neshama is hanging out. I mean, it's not human per se, it's a soul. Grains of wheat have souls, dogs have souls. They all have souls. Soul means a vivifying life energy. So why are we saying, oh, and this is so painful for the neshama not being in the body of a human? Because of this point. Because the neshama, in her essence and being, needs to give life. So when she's trapped in an animal or in a plant or in an inanimate, she can't express herself. She's not giving life to the dog when she's trapped in a dog. She's not giving life to the grain of wheat when she's trapped in the grain of wheat. She's just trapped there. She's like hostage there. She's not part of the life of that dog or that grain of wheat. She's not giving life. She's not doing what she needs to do. And as such, it's tremendously painful. So these 2 points are heightening our question. Again, our question is, the sages say, just as the soul fills the body, so God fills creation. And the Rebbe said, that's not a correct parallelism. The soul fills the body because the soul has a need to give life to the body. God doesn't have this must give life to creation. God could exist fine and wonderful without creation. And these points we just said about the need for the soul and the soul's pain in not being able to do her function all highlight this idea that this is the function of the soul. So again, we're now back to our question. What do our sages mean by saying, just as the soul gives life to the body, so too God gives life to creation? Okay, so Leah, you came at a good point because we are just sort of back to the question we started with. So I will recap briefly. We are discussing here, going through the four parts of Mincha Shmona Esrei. The first of those four sets of Chesed Gvur Tiferes was Atzecha B'Shimcha Echem Nikam Kisro Goyecha Ba'aretz Chesed Gvur Tiferes Chedim HaTzimtzum. And the Rebbe asked in this ice, what do you mean Chesed Gvur Tiferes Chedim HaTzimtzum? There is no Chesed Gvur Tiferes Chedim HaTzimtzum. And the Rebbe said, no, well, there is definitely chesed, because we're told that because of Hashem's teva tov lahetiv, that's why he constricted himself. So that means there's chesed. Okay, fine, I'll give you that. But how do we really understand this? So to understand this, we bring in this quote, which is what we're just right now trying to understand. Just like the soul fills the body, so does Hashem fill creation. And we said, what does that mean? It can't mean just as a soul has an essence desire to give life, and that's why she fills the body. God has this essence desire to give life, and he must give life, and therefore he fills creation, because if he didn't fulfill creation, like he wouldn't be doing his thing. So it's not true. It is the neshama's thing, and it's not God's thing. So what does it mean? So that's exactly what we're up to right now. The answer the Rebbe gives is, just as in the soul, yes, for the soul to give life to the body is a tremendous, tremendous descent for the soul. A tremendous, tremendous descent. But that descending of the soul and that giving of life to the body, the fact the soul can do it and what we see of the soul after she has descended to give life proves that originally that was part of her. And that's why she can do it after. Meaning, we see the soul as she is within a body. And the soul within a body has tremendous descent from the origin of the soul beyond the body. But whatever we see in the soul within the body, that proves to us that that had to exist in the soul before she descended to the body. Because if it didn't exist before, how could it exist after? So that same logic, and we're looking at the soul and we're saying, oh, the soul here in the body has this need to give life. That proves that the soul before she enters the body has a need to give life, even though the soul before she enters the body is so much higher than the soul after she's in the body. But again, if it didn't come from before, how could it be? So that concept is the same for Hashem in creation. Not the same issue, the need to give life, not the same issue, but the same relationship. Let me say it again, because these things are very nuanced, and I want to make sure it's clear. The saying of our sages is, just as the soul fills the body, so does God fill creation. And we questioned this, and we said, what's the parallelism here? The soul has a need to give life. That's why it fills the body. God doesn't have a need to give life, and that's why he fills creation. God could be without creation. So what does it mean? What's the relationship that our sages are making? So the Rebbe says the relationship is that just as we understand the soul prior to her descent into the body, based on what we see of the soul in the body, so too we understand God prior to creation, based on what we see of God within creation. So by the soul and by God, we're seeing two different things. But by both of them, the commonality, the parallelism is, if I see it when there's the descent, because there's enormous descent for the soul to be within the body, and there's enormous descent for God to be within creation. Obviously, the descent of God in creation is far greater than the descent of the soul within the body, but for both of them, it's a great descent. But what I'm seeing after, I'm seeing the soul tremendously descended to get into a body, has this need to give life. That proves to me that before the soul descended, she had this need to give life. Because if we see it after, it had to be before. So similarly with God in creation, if I'm seeing God in creation bestowing this kindness, that proves to me that before God invested himself in creation, he was Metzias, an existence of kindness. If this existence with this need, this desire, this deep pleasure in giving, in kindness, in beneficence. How do I know? I don't know what's going on before, because I see it after. And just as by the soul, what I see after is a proof for what was before, so too by God, what I see after God's nature of giving, of kindness, of beneficence, this proves it must have existed before. Because if it didn't exist before, how could it exist after? So all of this is affirming this concept of God prior to Tzimtzum Harishon already possessing chesed. Because the chesed was the catalyst to constrict himself. So there's a creation that Hashem can bestow kindness on. That's chesed. Where do we see Gevurah? Well, the Rebbe says Gevurah is, so to speak, even more simple. Because constriction is an act of Gevurah. In other words, as we forbrained a bit, constriction is coming from chesed. And because of chesed is the Gevurah, and the only reason for Hashem's constriction is because of a desire to give us, the constriction is for the Giloi, is for the revelation. So the motivation of the Gevurah is really chesed. I look and I see Gevurah, but if I could see under the surface, if I could see behind the scenes, if I could see the motivations of the script, it's all chesed. And we said that the prototype, and so true in our life, and so true in our world, and so true in our reality, and so true in the cosmos. Whenever you see Gevurah, understand the rationale, the motivation, the reason for this Gevurah is ultimately for an expression of chesed. But on the surface, it's Gevurah. So if I'm looking at constriction, and I'm saying based on the Arizal, because Hashem has Teva Tov Lahetiv, Hashem has this desire to give, that's why he constricted himself to give to us. So this proves there's chesed. It for sure proves there's Gevurah. Because constriction comes from Hashem's Gevurah, even though it's really motivated by chesed. So chesed, I know for sure, because that was a Teva Tov Lahetiv that motivated the constriction. Gevurah, I know even more for sure, so to speak, because Tzimtzum is Gevurah. Tzimtzum, constriction, is an expression of God's Gevurah, of God's withholding nature. Because Gevurah is expressed in Tzimtzum, right? Tzimtzum is constriction of self. What motivates, what allows there to be constriction of self? Gevurah, a withdrawal of self. So I see the chesed, because that's why he constricted himself. I see the Gevurah, because that is what Tzimtzum is. So chesed and Gevurah, I see for sure before there's any Tzimtzum Harishon. What about Tiferes? Tiferes is, because what is Tiferes? Tiferes is the perfect blending of chesed and Gevurah. In other words, if you think of it, usually it's drawn as like a upside down triangle. Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes. We have chesed on the right, Gevurah on the left, and they funnel in to this point on the bottom, which is Tiferes, the blending of chesed and Gevurah. Chesed is the blues, and Gevurah is the reds. Tiferes is the yellow. So chesed and Gevurah blend and become Tiferes. This perfect balance, this harmony, this truth, Torah. So if we proved that there was definitely chesed before Tzimtzum Harishon, because Teva Tov Lahetiv, the nature of one who is good is to do good, and because of Hashem's desire to give, he constricted himself. If we proved there was Gevurah, constriction, withdrawal, prior to Tzimtzum Harishon, because what creates Tzimtzum, constriction, is Gevurah, is withholding. So for sure, we see there was chesed before Tzimtzum Harishon. For sure, we see there was Gevurah before Tzimtzum Harishon. There had to be Tiferes then, because what is Tiferes? She's the perfect blend of chesed and Gevurah. So that means, as the Rebbe said, but there was chesed Gevurah Tiferes before Tzimtzum Harishon. What is this emphasis of echad? Echad means it's all one. There's no differentiation. Pshitus, simplicity. But now I'm saying there's chesed, there's Gevurah, there's Tiferes. So there was the primordial chesed, primordial Gevurah, primordial Tiferes. They were in a very incipient state, right? Almost like in a latent dimension. There was that energy that would be fully expressed as chesed. And there was that energy that after Tzimtzum will be expressed as Gevurah. And there was that energy that after Tzimtzum will become Tiferes. They were all latent but existent energies. So we just proved they were existent. There was for sure chesed, there was for sure Gevurah, there was for sure Tiferes. We proved they existed, but they were in what I'm calling a latent state, like in utero state, Because ata echad, shimcha echad, echad, one, one, one. Why are we calling it one, one, one? Because before Tzimtzum Harishon, there's just pshitas. There's just achdus. There's unity. There's oneness. There's no differentiation. And chesed versus Pharis is differentiation. So on one hand, we're saying ata echad, shimcha echad, mika amcha yishal goy echad ba'aretz, because this is prior to Tzimtzum Harishon. It's all echad, echad, echad. It's all pshitas. It's all one. There's no differentiation. On the other hand, those three phrases mean chesed versus Pharis that existed before Tzimtzum Harishon, and we just proved that chesed versus Pharis existed before Tzimtzum Harishon. So how do we put the two together? They existed, but in a very latent state. It was like the first potential for chesed, potential for gevurah, potential for tiferes. So on one hand, it's echad, echad, echad. It's pshitus. It's achdus. No coloration, no differentiation. We don't see no blue or no red or no yellow. It's all one. On the other hand, within this oneness, there's already the potential. What will be after Tzimtzum Harishon of the Chesed Gvur Tiferes, as we see in the next step, right? Tiferes Gedula, Tiferes Yeshua, clear Chesed Gvur Tiferes in Adam Kadmon, the Kabbalistic term Adam Kadmon, meaning the first revelation of the supernal will of God, Ratzon HaElyon, post Tzimtzum Harishon. So post Tzimtzum Harishon, suddenly we have full-blown Chesed, full-blown Gvur, full-blown Tiferes, coming from the latent potential, not really expressed because it's all echad, echad, echad. But within that echad, 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 we have what the voice that will be chesed and the voice that will be gevurah and the voice that will be tiferes. Those voices already exist, as we see from after. Now we could question tiferes gedula, tiferes Yeshua, yom menucha, ukedusha amcha nosata. And those three phrases again referring to chesed, gevurah, tiferes after Tzimtzum Harishon, in Adam Kadmon, in Keser Vatzilus, and it's Nasata. Nasata means what was before is now given over and expressed here. So it's like, wow. But is that really so? Because we're told there's such a par in the energies prior to versus post Tzimtzum Harishon. Meaning everything after Tzimtzum Harishon is so tiny compared to before, but then we're saying in the words of our davening, Nasata, you gave over, like you gave over Mirshus L'Rishus, from this domain to this domain, the Chesed of Gvur Tiferes of prior to Tzimtzum Harishon, Nasata now becomes given over the Chesed of Gvur Tiferes after Tzimtzum Harishon. And the Rebbe brings a quote to prove more than what's incomparable, creation versus the what's called ne'etzolim, which is what creation emerged from. Meaning, what we're comparing here is the spiritual realities of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. Those are creation to the ne'etzolim, the primordial movements, which is the world of Atzilus. Just as it's incomparable, the energies of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, the three lower worlds, to Atzilus, because Atzilus is so much higher. Guess what? It's a lot more incomparable, the energy of Atzilus, to the Ein Sof that preceded Atzilus. So however incomparable Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya is, the three lower worlds of creation and formation and descent are so incomparable compared to Atzilus, the world of being that's so much more intent, God himself. Well, guess what? That's nothing. That small change compared to Atzilus and the Ein Sof, the infinity of God that preceded Atzilus. So Atzilus to Ein Sof is far more vast, the difference, than Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya to Atzilus. And the Rebbe says, what's expressed here, what we're referencing, which is Tikkunei Zohar, a section of Zohar, is only comparing Atzilus to Ein Sof. We're not comparing Atzilus to Kodim HaTzimtzum, you know. So if Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, this vastness between that and Atzilus is so less than Atzilus to Ein Sof, because Atzilus to Ein Sof is so much more different. Can you imagine Atzilus to Kodim HaTzimtzum? We're not even talking about that, right? There's nothing to say. Then how can we say that well, there was Chesed Gvur Tiferes before Tzimtzum, and then Nasata, you gave this over, and then we had Chesed Gvur Tiferes after Tzimtzum. Like, hello, how could there be this relationship? But you're saying Nasata, you gave it over, and the Rebbe said Nasata means Mershus L'Rishus. There was Chesed Gvur Tiferes before Tzimtzum Rishon. Nasata, now there's Chesed Gvur Tiferes after Tzimtzum Rishon. Sounds like so simple, right? Just turning a page or going to the next station. But if we can't even compare Bri Siyar to Atzilos, and we far more can't compare Atzilos to Ein Sof, and we can't even compare so much that we don't even talk about Atzilos to Kaidim Atzimtzum, what are we saying? What's this Nasata business? There's no connection. What are we talking about here? How come we're making it sound like there's a connection? So that's the final point we're going to say. So the Rebbe says, so basically the answer the Rebbe gives to that is, Nasata means there's a Giloi, there's a revelation of the Indian, meaning prior to Tzimtzum Harishon, prior to that primordial constriction, there's Chesed Gvur Tiferes. Nasata, that Indian of Chesed Gvur Tiferes, that Giloi of Chesed Gvur Tiferes was given over from before Tzimtzum Harishon to after Tzimtzum Harishon. Before Tzimtzum Harishon, Chesed Gvur Tiferes, Nasata, you gave over this Inyan. Post Tzimtzum Harishon, we also have Chesed Gvur Tiferes, but it's only a Giloi of the Inyan. It's only a revelation of that, style of expression. The real deal, the real essence of Chesed Gvur Tiferes Kodim Tzimtzum Harishon, no way, was not given over at all, has no relationship to Chesed Gvur Tiferes after Tzimtzum Harishon. Let me review this because I know these ideas are quite deep. So I'm going to say it one more time to make sure it's very clear. So we had our original question of this ice. How could the Rebbe say, is Chesed Gvur Tiferes prior to Tzimtzum Harishon? There was no Chesed Gvur Tiferes prior to Tzimtzum Harishon. And the answer is, we proved there was. We proved there was Chesed, Teva Tov L'Heitiv, Hashem's nature is to do good, that's Chesed. We proved there's Gevura. Tzimtzum Harishon obviously had to come from a force of Gevura. We proved there's Tiferes, because when you take a Chesed, you take a Gevura, you blend it, you got a Tiferes. So we proved that yes, there was Chesed Gvur Tiferes before Tzimtzum Harishon. And then we said, but the whole point was Echad, 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 because it's Pshitus, because it's simplicity, because there's no coloration, there's no differentiation. Chesed Gvur Tiferes sounds like differentiation. It's the potential of Chesed and Gvur and Tiferes. It's latent Chesed Gvur Tiferes. So what I would see, of course I can't see there, but if I could see it, I would just see the oneness. I would just see the Pshitus. I would just see the simplicity. But underneath is really the potential that is expressed in Tzimtzum Harishon of Chesed and Gvur and therefore of Tiferes. Now we followed up with our last question and answer of the evening, which is, but wait a minute. How can we say that there was Chesed Gvur Tiferes before Tzimtzum Harishon, and then Tiferes Gedula, Tiferes Yeshua, Nasata, you transferred that Chesed Gvur Tiferes of Kodim Tzimtzum Harishon to the Chesed Gvur Tiferes of after Tzimtzum Harishon? When, how could that be if we're told that there's no relationship between Atzilus and Ein Sof, let alone between Atzilus and Kodim Tzimtzum Harishon? So how could the energies of after Tzimtzum Harishon be just, a transfer from what was before? That was the question. And the answer we just said was, after Tzimtzum Harishon, the Nasata element, why the words of davening say Nasata, which we explain means, like one moves from one Rishus to another Rishus. We have the Rishus of before Tzimtzum Harishon, and we took those energies, Chesed Gvur Tiferes, before Tzimtzum Harishon, and we moved them, we transferred them to Chesed Gvur Tiferes after Tzimtzum Harishon. That Nasata, that transferring from Rishus to Rishus, is the style of energy, the Gilui of the Inyan of Chesed and Gvur and Tiferes. So there's a potential Chesed Gvur Tiferes energy before Tzimtzum Harishon, and Nasata, we transferred that to the Chesed Gvur Tiferes style energy after Tzimtzum Harishon. But that's only talking about a Gilui of the Inyan, a revelation of that style, like a Chesed style and a Gevura style and Tiferes style, but just the style, not the real thing. Like just we would talk about like a knockoff model, right? You don't have the real Uggs. You have the knockoff Uggs. You don't have the real AirPods. You have the knockoff AirPods. So what does that mean? That means there's a certain item And this is like its style, but not the same thing, because the same thing would be a lot more. So that's a very poor mushal, but it sort of works, that we're only talking about the style. We're not talking about the real thing. The real energy of chesed, gevura, and tiferes, the mahus, the atzmus, the power of this latent chesed, gevura, tiferes, kodim, tzimtzum, harishon. No way, we're not touching that. That doesn't exist at all, and that was not transferred to after tzimtzum harishon, like we said. Atzilus can't even touch Ein Sof. Could Atzilus touch kodim, tzimtzum, harishon? No way. So obviously, the real deal chesed, gevura, tiferes of kodim, tzimtzum, harishon did not transfer and become the chesed, gevura, tiferes of after tzimtzum harishon. What transferred was that style, right? Like we're saying, the knockoff brand, the energy, what it looks like. But the real thing itself stayed in the state of kodim, tzimtzum, harishon. You can say, what do you mean stayed in the state of? Isn't that like there was and now there is? No, not at all. All these things are happening concurrently. Again, time is a box we're in. It's not a box that infringes on God. So at this moment, concurrently, there's kodim, tzimtzum, harishon, there's tzimtzum, harishon, there's post tzimtzum, harishon, there's olam ha'tohu, there's shviras hakelim, there's tikkus. Everything's happening all at once. So at this moment, kodim, tzimtzum, harishon, there is chesed, gevura, tiferes, whose energy, whose essence, whose being is only kodim, tzimtzum, harishon, and never transferred to Adam Kadmon, Keser, all the highest ne'etzolim, highest beings after tzimtzum, harishon. But the style, the energy, what looks like the same general flow of what chesed seems like to us and gevura seems like and tiferes seems like, that style existed before tzimtzum harishon, and that style transferred to after tzimtzum harishon. But the real deal, no, we can't touch the real deal. That's where we get the knockoffs. So we can't touch the real deal, chesed, gevura, tiferes, prior to tzimtzum harishon. We have, so to speak, the knockoff model, chesed, gevura, tiferes, much, much, much weaker of after tzimtzum harishon. All right, we got through.